there any motions from the floor? Representative Gilchrist. Is there a second? Assuming unanimous consent, are there any nominations? Representative Gilchrist.
I nominate first F1, the College for All Act, followed by F2, the People Before Party Act, followed by F4, which is the Clean Water Act, NSDA Act.
Second adopted.
Is there another motion?
Second.
Assuming unanimous consent, so motion. All right, we'll now begin voting on docket A. All those wishing to affirm, please rise and sit when I point to you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 23. Okay, that's a unanimous consent. As such, we will now begin debate on docket A. Is there a sponsorship? Representative, can't see your placard. Dean, you have the floor.
Thank you. That is Representative Dean, D-E-A-N for the judges, hailing from the Arizona District. Opening the session up. I'm just going to nod indication you vote. All right. I'll assume most of you are ready. The chair ready?
Yeah, I believe that you should stand by the
Stand right
microphone
there?
so
Okay.
it picks up. And
Gotcha.
then questioners, make sure you stand by that microphone.
All right. Sure. As governors like Doug Ducey of my home state started to cut education funding, our students began to struggle. And because we need to give them the relief to get out of this struggle, stand with me and affirm today's legislation. Because first, we have to see that rising tuition is directly correlated with cuts in state budget funding, and that's why today's legislation is so effective. Because as Ben Akers explains for the Brookings Institution on January 12th of this year, that over the last 20 years, public tuition for universities at four-year colleges has more than doubled. And in fact, there is no similar hike in the economy in any other sector, and what we can see is our students are falling behind. And that's a problem because college is still valuable to all of those who go to it, bringing over a 15% return on investment for those who can actually afford it. But the problem in the status quo is those who can't are stuck with student loans and debt for the rest of their lives. And the problem is the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities explains on May 26th of this year that over $8.7 billion has been cut from state budgets since the recession. And in fact, even before the recession, we saw dismally low funding for public education, and therefore the cost was passed on to the students. Which is why Section 1 of today's legislation specifically focuses on funding these states in order to provide this vital service to our students. Because right now, student aid simply hasn't kept up, and the price for college is rising faster than the median wage. We need to do something to help those in the lowest socioeconomic classes afford the opportunity of education to move themselves forward in their careers and their lives. That's exactly what you do by affirming today's legislation, and you allow us to help those in need. But we have to see exactly why today's funding mechanism is the best way to do it, not only to promote educational standards, but also to ensure that we have a long-term and stable economy for the future. Because as the Georgetown Center on Education explains in their 2013 analysis, that college graduation helps lower crime rates and promote better health, promote better community involvement, inform skilled laborers, and ensure we have a civically minded nation, which all makes sense from a college education. When we look towards the specific funding mechanism in today's legislation, what we use is a financial transaction tax. And that's vitally important. Because as MFS Investing explains, a financial transaction tax ensures that we decrease the short-term investment that is risky in our economy and ensures that we have more medium and long-term investment for stable economic growth. And as a University of Massachusetts Amherst study in 2002 explains, that this would produce billions of dollars for the federal government in revenue, which we can then pass on as savings to our students to ensure that they can get the college education that they need to move forward in our lives. So not only are we ensuring that we have a better and more civically minded nation with a strong education, but we're also ensuring that we have a strong long-term economy for the future. Because passing today's legislation promotes a good education, a good economy, and therefore affirm.
For the judges, that speech was 3 minutes exactly. All questioners rise. Representative Gilchrist, Representative Kleinle, Representative Kalmbach, and Representative Simmerberg.
So, Representative, if states are having budget cuts, then how can we expect them to take on extra burdens without solving the state budget deficit?
Okay, in today's legislation, they're only taking about 1/3 of the cost, which would actually be less than they're paying in the status quo. The federal government is giving them more money, and therefore that's passing savings on to the states, and therefore the students.
Thank you. Could you explain to me exactly why college costs are so inflated right now?
What I explained to you is the reason is these states are cutting money after the recession because right now they think that's the best place that they can gain savings in their budget. But that's not true because the education is one of the strongholds of our future. It's the foundation for our future, and therefore we need to ensure they have the funding to give the education necessary.
Thanks.
Is the funding allocated in today's bill truly enough to ensure that colleges aren't going to be lowering their standards for students?
We ensure that with the funding provided in that UMass Amherst study, we see that we're gaining billions of dollars through this financial transaction tax, which ensures that we pass those savings on to our students.
Thank you. How is consumer behavior impacted by financial transaction tax on the market?
So when we look at the financial transaction tax, there will be distortions from the tax, but that goes to short-term risky investment, which is actually beneficial for our economy because it promotes safe, long-term investments that promote stable growth.
Representatives Ambrose, Shaikh, Singh, and Estelle.
Representative, how would this legislation affect private colleges?
So private colleges aren't covered under today's legislation, but they've had a much lower growth rate in their tuition, which means they don't need this help as much. Public tuition has more than doubled over the last 20 years. That's a significant problem, Representative.
Thank you.
How effective has a financial transaction tax been in raising revenues in other first world countries in which it's been implemented?
It hasn't been implemented in many markets like the United States. When we look towards the study and analysis done by multiple universities and at their economic models, we can see that we're going to be gaining billions of dollars. That's the UMass Amherst study.
Thank you. Would a college continue to get subsidized even if it had dismal graduation rates?
Even if it had dismal graduation rates, there's nothing in today's legislation that would necessarily stop that. But we have to look towards whole-scale education reform. Right now, our students can't even afford to go to college in the first place, so they can't even afford to graduate.
Thank you.
The speaker and any further questioners may take their seats.
Thank you.
All negative speakers, please rise. Representative Ambrose.
Just based off of how that last question period went, are you picking 4 speakers from one side and 4 from another? Or was that just random?
It's at random.
Thank you.
For the judges, I am Representative Ambrose, speaking for the first time today.
Is this a good distance from the microphone?
Is the chamber in order? In that case, I'll begin. Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman once said, "There's nothing that does so much harm as good intentions." I have no doubt that affirmative speakers intend to make college affordable and to expand higher education for all. But representatives, when this legislation destroys our financial markets and we're repealing this bill next year, those good intentions will be no consolation. Representatives, I want a bill that will still be around when my children go to college, and for that reason, I stand against the College for All Act of 2016. I ask you all to negate this legislation, firstly and most importantly, because the funding mechanism is never going to be enough to sustain a college investment program in the long term. Representative Dean, I fully appreciate your support of the financial transaction tax, but the reality is that no financial transaction tax is ever going to provide enough funding for us to make college free, tuition free for all students. In fact, the financial transaction tax in the United States will only encourage investors to move their money and their businesses to overseas trading floors as they begin to invest in other Asian and European trading markets. This is not some economic theory, representatives. This is empirically the experience of nations which have tried a financial transaction tax. For support, I turn to the New York Times in 2013, which notes that in 1984, Sweden implemented a similar financial transaction tax. Predictably, 30 to 50% of their trading shifted to Britain, and the country actually ended up losing more from the capital gains tax than they gained from the financial transaction tax. Representatives, Sweden actually lost money when they implemented an FTT. When we pass this legislation and try to fund college through this tax, the reality is that likely we will end up losing money as our investors leave the United States and the US economy shrinks. That means that at best, this program is not sustainable in the long term. And it's no wonder then that data from the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget finds that this program would add between $2 and $15 trillion to the national debt. Representatives, this program will never work and it will never be sustainable in the long term, especially when you consider that, that this legislation specifically would also increase the cost of college. Section 2, lines 13 and 14 specifically outline that 75% of public tuition of public schools professors must be tenured, and that's going to massively increase costs for these colleges to do their business. According to Mark Taylor of Columbia University, colleges tie up between $10 and $12 million of their endowment to support a single tenured professor. Representatives, forcing these public institutions to shift towards 75% tenured professors is only going to raise the cost of college even further, making the money allocated for this legislation not enough in the long term. Especially when you consider the masses of people that will now be enrolling in college, increasing the costs even more. Representatives, this legislation is a good idea in theory, but this bill specifically will not fund the program sufficiently, and that is why I ask you all to negate.
The judges, that speech was 3 minutes and 4 seconds. All questioners rise. Representative Rich, Polzaretsky, Pennington, and Boyd.
Hi, Representative Ambrose. Will the FTT really not be enough to fund this initiative, even if the states are required to match half of each grant given to them?
Absolutely not. In the end, a financial transaction tax has a very real chance of losing the United States money, and we still have to provide 2/3 of the funding for this program. It will never be enough.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are investors in Sweden as attracted to the industry in Sweden as they are here in America?
Well, Representative, I don't think that there's anything special about an American trading floor that couldn't also be achieved by a European or Asian trading floor. The only thing that we have going for us right now is that our floors are untaxed.
Do you believe that increasing the salaries and incomes of these new college students could help to provide additional revenue to fund this bill?
Well, unless we are specifically educating people on how to be stockbrokers and stay in the United States, a financial transaction tax won't take advantage of that, since this is funded specifically by an FTT.
Why does your example of Sweden matter, considering the difference in magnitude between their tax and our tax?
Well, Representative, all I know is that when Sweden implemented a financial transaction tax, which is what this legislation does, it will only result in a net loss of revenue, or at best, not nearly as much as this program requires. Even if Sweden had different rates, the economic realities are the same.
Representative Dean, Scheich, and Eunice.
How is a 0.1 financial transaction tax too onerous for these companies?
Well, Representative, many other nations that have implemented a financial transaction tax implement at a rate of around 0.05%. And so even if other nations have taxes, they're lower than us. So naturally, these employers and stock traders will be more incentive to go towards the lower tax.
On average, in the status quo, what % of professors at public institutions are already tenured?
I do not have that information. However, I presume it is lower than 75%, because if it is higher than or equal to 75%, then that section of the legislation is meaningless and would do nothing.
Thank you.
Speaker, and any further questioners may take their seats.
I thank the chair.
All affirmative speakers, please rise. Mr.
How are you choosing questioners?
It's at random. I am choosing questioners completely at random. Representative Polzaretsky.
I take the chair against the judges. Representative Polzaretsky for the first time today. Speaking in the affirmation, give me a nod when you're ready. I'll begin. Representative Ambrose, you just stood up here and gave us a speech where you made it very clear that you're concerned about two things. You're concerned about our constituents being educated, and you're concerned about the impacts that today's legislation will have on the economy. Now, Representative Ambrose, I'm happy to stand here today and tell you that your worries are unwarranted, because in reality, today's legislation gives us better education, better jobs, and a better future for each and every one of our constituents. So first, let's understand how by passing today's legislation, we are making college more affordable, and as a result, reducing the amount of community college dropouts that we see in the status quo. Now, right now, the amount of people dropping out of college after they enter it is a huge issue, and by passing today's legislation, we fix that. This is explained from a study from Dindar Sharipa of the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center in November of 2014. He explains that 61% of first-time undergraduates who enroll make every single community college status quo, is that students who are...
Good morning, Representative. How would today's legislation affect the market for student loan asset-backed securities?
So it's going to make the demand for student loans go down, but that's a good thing because it lets students focus more on finding careers that are better fit for them instead of having to find fast careers to pay off their loans.
Thank you.
You mentioned that this legislation helps students focus on their studies by decreasing worries about rent and other socioeconomic difficulties. Does it actually help with either of those things, or does it just help with tuition?
So today's legislation doesn't go directly towards rent, but the reality is if they're not spending $1 on tuition, they can then spend another $1 on it, and that helps them.
Thank you.
Speaker may take his seat.
Take the chair.
All negative speakers, please rise. Representative Gilchrist.
Thank you, Chair.
For the judges, Representative Gilchrist, speaking for the first time. Is this a good distance? All right, great. And just let me know when you're all ready. Everyone's good? Okay, no, everyone's good? Excellent. A few months ago, Bernie Sanders said, "When I become president, the first thing I'll do is make college free for everyone." But now the primary is over, and it's become apparent that Bernie Sanders becoming president is just as much a fantasy as the affirmation of today's legislation. As much as we want it to happen, it will never come true, so we have to fail. So first, fail today's legislation because a financial transaction tax would be disastrous for our economy. Now, Representative Ambrose has already told us that with this tax, investors are going to go overseas, like to Tokyo, where there's no tax. But then Representative Polzarewski, you refuted this by saying he only presented evidence from Sweden, and that doesn't apply. But here's evidence from the United States that says exactly the same thing. The Tax Foundation of May 21st, 2015, as well as the U.S. Fund and Asset Management Association of December 2013, tells us that a 0.1% financial because we're going to be taking away the when we pass this legislation, we don't make college free. Representative Dean told us how states are cutting their budgets for education. And now that is true, but actually that's a reason to negate, because it exemplifies the issue that states don't have any extra money in their budgets right now. And this legislation does nothing to solve that problem, Representative Dean. In fact, it allocates no extra funding to the states. It asks them to provide half of the funding we need for this legislation, $40 billion, but it doesn't provide them any way to get that money. So it asks them to find this $40 billion. It just does not exist right now. In fact, the National Conference of State Legislators tells us that 49 states right now are facing major budget crises and have been forced to cut areas, not just education, but also areas like libraries and recreation and law enforcement. So when we pass this legislation, we're making that issue even worse. So one of two things will happen. The states will refuse to participate in this program and nothing will change, or they're going to either raise taxes or take away money from other vital areas. We can't pass this legislation. We can't ask states to take on this burden that is just too big for them to bear. Representatives, in today's debate, don't talk about what you want to happen. Talk about what can happen. Talk about what's realistic and practical, and this legislation is not. So stand with me and negate.
The judges, that speech was 3 minutes and 3 seconds. All questioners rise. Representative Leckie, Representative Skidon, Representative Eunice, and Representative Brown.
Good morning, Ms. Gilchrist. If companies would be laying off people because of an FTT, why haven't we seen that in Europe?
Because but they just can't. Investment, that we're losing jobs. So when people graduate college, it's making them harder to find jobs.
Spelled Y-O-U. For the judges, parliamentarian, presenting officer, this is Representative Eunice, spelled Y-O-U-N-U-S, speaking for the first time this legislative session. Whenever you guys are ready, just give me an indication, I'll begin. All right. Putting on one more. All right. The job market today is as competitive as it's ever been, but unfortunately for me, I was attracted by the flashy advertisements of my alma mater. Unfortunately, it seems a diploma from Trump University doesn't just go as far as any other university. So I decided to look for a job that better fit my diploma, and I became a congressman. But it's with today's legislation that we see that we're not going to be luring the same innocent Americans into these predatory for-profit institutions that exist in the status quo to reap havoc on our students, and we're also going to be decreasing the phenomenon of undermatching that we're ultimately going to be passing an affirmative ballot. So first, let's understand every speaker on the affirmative's arguments are going to be refuted by the claim that we're going to be decreasing the influence of for-profit predatory colleges. Now, predatory, or rather, O is by affirming, and by making undermatching why.
Thank you, Representative. If for-profit universities are so bad as you say, then why do minorities and underprivileged people apply to them in the status quo?
Because they advertise themselves as cheaper than the alternatives by passing.
While we're getting set up here, I am Representative Logan Potter